the fuselage was still to be seen
There you go.
in the waters.
It was the first sitting of that, the 1976 Parliament, the first day of the sitting of the Parliament. It was in September. So it was a bomb that was on board the aircraft, or bombs, that brought it down, right here off of our shores. So sometimes people say, why is terrorism important to Barbados? Well, certainly for Barbadians of my age, we clearly remember, I was certainly old enough to remember all of the issues that abounded at the time related to this incident. Now, I think that once you have been affected by terrorist activity of any type, one has to always be proactive like in any other area to ensure that your legislation and all the activities related to it in a modern environment are in fact addressed. We cannot wait until something happens, then we say, well, we should have done this or we should have done that. And certainly the world has changed since 1976. So a lot of the methodologies, a lot of the, in terms of execution, a lot of the areas in which people finance and use the money in this endeavor, that too has changed, certainly in the way in which it's moved around, the way in which it's gathered, even the way in which it is used. So these are things that are addressed clearly in these two pieces of legislation. I think most Bajans will remember, of course, September 11, 2001 in New York with the World Trade Center. And why do we remember that? Because it was not just Americans that were in the World Trade Center, but persons of Barbadian heritage that many of us knew and know their families that were in the World Trade Center on that day when the terrorists struck home. Even though it's not as close to our shores as right off our shores of St. James, it certainly affected many Barbadians, certainly because, as I said, there are people in that building who died and some who were injured who were certainly of Barbadian heritage. And so once again, terrorism struck home to us as people, as a people. You know, terrorism has no race. It really doesn't. Don't mind what people are trying to say. It has no race. It has no gender. It has no religion. It has no socio-economic background, Mr. President. Terrorism affects everyone. We often hear, you know, especially nowadays, that, especially a lot in newscasts, because, you know, the news media is often very good, depending on which one you're listening to, as to who they will cast blame on, or who they will indicate to us are the proponents of any particular activity. Now, if you listen to a lot of the Western news media enough, one will assume that the only terrorists in the world are all Muslims. You know, we always hear about Al-Qaeda and the Boko Harams and the ISIS and all these Muslim groups. These are the terrorists. Probably because we live in the western part of the world, I suppose then that's what we will hear about most, simply because it affects Western societies. So we hear about that. And so the perpetrators are normally Muslims. But, you know, we all know that the incident that happened here off of our shores in 1976, those people were not Muslims. They were, in fact, Christians. So when I say that terrorism has no religion, that debunks that myth, certainly for us, as well as many other parts of the world where we see all types of terrorist activities. I won't go through all of them. I won't go through all of the bombings that would have happened in Ireland and those places many years ago and all over the world in Spain as to who the people are. But I'm saying clearly that we are not to fool ourselves and feel that terrorists have only one particular religion or one particular race or gender or anything of that nature. It is not so. Terrorism is terrorism, and it is perpetuated, and it affects everyone. Now, Many of the issues that present themselves when it comes to terrorism have a financial component, Mr. President. These bills address the various methodologies for combating misuse of the finances. Certainly on our shores, we need to ensure that we weed this out. Barbados is a well-known compliant financial jurisdiction, and we would want to remain so. These pieces of legislation are far-reaching, where it even ensures that people who may not actually effect the terrorist act, but help with its facilitation, Mr. President, by either directly or indirectly providing funds, or indirectly providing travel, use of property, training, or in any way, Mr. President, aiding or abetting or engaging in this type of activity. So in other words, you don't have to be the actual person committing the act. You just have to be someone who aids and abets them in many different ways in order to have the act committed. Now, we know that certainly financial implications and financial assistance is one of the things that is often spoken about and referred to when it comes to this type of activity. And these pieces of legislation deal squarely with it and ensure that we're able to help to combat it and to stop the misuse of any finances in this direction. Now, it specifically speaks to money laundering, a well-known methodology for the commission of all types of illegal acts. That in itself is an illegal act. I think people who have been engaged in money laundering well understand when they're caught, that is not something you wish to be engaged in. But certainly for the purpose of the funding of terrorist activities, we know that money laundering is a well-known methodology for that purpose and for the diversion of funds for the purpose of use within this endeavor. And so these amendments speak clearly to that, and they provide for penalties that will assist in both deterring and remedying any persons, entities that are involved in the use of this type of activity for the support of terrorism. It gives the legal powers far-reaching powers on conviction. It can go from the simple freezing of orders of money and property to fines and jail time. Now, clearly, like any other piece of legislation, there must be penalties that are commensurate with the type of activity, and all activities may not be the same. So therefore, we have a wide range of penalties that are included within these amendments to ensure that is properly dealt with. Now, all over the world, we see many terrorist activities being transmitted into our homes via the numerous media vehicles available. We are able to look at some of our Caribbean brothers and sisters who are, as I speak, struggling with citizens returning from areas where there's a proliferation of terrorist activities, where they have gone and been involved allegedly in them or been trained. I mean, people close to our shores. We see it all the time. We see it in the newspaper, on television, we see it on the internet, and we see that some of our own CARICOM brothers and sisters are struggling in order to combat what is occurring with some of their citizens who have got themselves, unfortunately, engaged in this type of activity. Certainly, we would not want that here on our shores. So this bill is a step in the right direction to be proactive and not reactive to ensuring that Barbadians and Barbados is prepared from a legislative framework to address an issue that seems to have increased worldwide, both with domestic and foreign terrorist activities. You only got to turn on any news station almost weekly now, and we see some level of activity that people deem to be a terrorist activity. We're hearing more and more about homegrown terrorists in some large countries where, for whatever reason, they have decided that they must get rid of a certain set of people. And who are these people they're getting rid of? For all kind of reasons. It could be a religious reason. Let's get rid of all the Christians, or let's get rid of all the Jews. Let's get rid of the Muslims. Let's get rid of the brown people. Let's get rid of the people who speak another language. And we see this all the time. But this legislation squarely deals with something that the world is struggling with. So we want to ensure that as a jurisdiction, that we put ourselves in the right place. Now, why are some of these things being so pervasive? My own belief is that the world has come closer to us, and every day it gets closer to us. The internet allows us to see what people are involved in, but it also allows people who want to be involved in certain types of activity that access as well. I mean, you could go on the internet and learn how to make anything you want, bombs and this and that. It's there and available to all. It has brainwashed thousands of people to be in whatever they feel that is their cause. All sorts of websites are dedicated to all types of activities that are undesirable. Certainly any type of terrorist activity is undesirable. All sorts of social media platforms are available for people to get on. I call them the hate platforms, where you can go on these platforms and spew your venom and hate, and then you're brainwashing, trying to take some kind of improper activity in order to address and appease this hate that is now built up in you because you believe they're like people that you're able to interact with and converse with through the internet and these social media platforms. The world of technology is bringing us ever closer every day, every night. We as a nation must be vigilant and take all necessary steps to be proactive and to ensure that we have processes that will protect our citizens and deter terrorist activity as much as possible wherever we see it being employed. Now, these two pieces of legislation go a long way in doing just this. It allows us as a nation to, one, ensure that our reputation as a safe jurisdiction is maintained. It allows us, as I said earlier in my opening, to comply with certain international obligations, both with the United Nations Assembly and the FATC, and it also allows us to demonstrate that this jurisdiction will not be used as much as possible where we have passed legislation to deter the improper use of financial platforms in order to support any of these types of activities. Now, in order for us to ensure that these pieces of legislation are amended and brought into force for the benefit of all Barbadians, there will be an amendment of Section 16 of the Constitution to give effect to Sections 8, 10B, and 10C. Now, we never take these things lightly, but what we must recognize as a country and as people is that it's our duty to ensure where we can that we maintain the security of our country for the benefit of our citizens. And with those few remarks, Mr. President, I move that this bill be read a second time.
Question is, that the bill under consideration be now read a second time. I recognize. Any speakers?
Senator Cummings.
Senator Cummings?
Mr. President, good morning. I rise on this occasion, Mr. President, to give my support to these bills before us. I understand we are treating to the joint issues of counterterrorism measures as well as the Customs Amendment Bill jointly. Mr. President, our acting leader of government business in the Senate has in great detail outlined the context for these matters and why, in this instance, Mr. President, it is important for us to treat to the question of how we manage our legislative process with regard to the prevention of terrorism. Mr. President, my comments today will focus very specifically on the intersection between the management of counterterrorism measures and how they feed into the Customs Amendment Bill, which we are considering jointly. Mr. President, typically when we have these conversations, we're talking about the already existing instruments to which we have signed globally. I'm talking namely in this instance, Mr. President, about instruments like the UN Convention Against Terrorism, talking about, Mr. President, instruments like the Inter-American Convention on Counterterrorism, which incidentally, Mr. President, was signed right here, was adopted right here in Barbados in June of 2002 during the Organization of American States General Assembly, Mr. President. And so Barbados has played a significant role for a very long time in treating to the questions of counterterrorism, even though, with the exception of instances which we all remember, instances which were just made reference to by Senator Moe, we have not suffered so far the kinds of atrocities that we have seen in other parts of the world on a day-to-day basis, Mr. President. And so sometimes there's a real danger, Mr. President, of being lulled into a false sense of security where we have not been dealing with some of these issues on a day-to-day basis. Mr. President, when September 11th happened, I remember it vividly, Mr. President, because one, I have a family member who used to work at Windows on the World that sat at the top of Tower 2, and just in the summer before, when I was attending the UN General Assembly, the Millennium General Assembly, at the time, on behalf of the Foreign Ministry, I had gone to Windows of the World to visit that family member. And on the day that those planes struck those two towers, that was her first day of vacation, Mr. President. And I remember how an incident like that resonated all across the world in families and households in countries far and near, right here in Barbados. I remember at the time having a conversation, Mr. President, with my family who was traumatized because my own mother that morning, Mr. President, was able to recall going just a few weeks before to take flying fish. When you have Barbadians going back to their adopted homes, you have to take cheese and you have to take flying fish. And my mother had gone just 3 weeks prior to take flying fish to this woman who was going back to work with my aunt, Mr. President. She perished that morning of September 11th. I remember it, Mr. President. She was going back to work and she went into work early to pick up a shift when she should have already have gone in a little later in the day. And she, a Barbadian who had visited her home just a few weeks ago, taken back the Barbadian goodies for her Barbadian family and friends, lost her life on that morning, Mr. President, of September 11th. I remember it also, Mr. President, because I at the time was being transferred from our headquarters to take up post in our office in Washington, D.C., which was really the second ground zero for the terrorism attacks that took place in the United States. And I remember at the time asking my permanent secretary, are you sure I'm still going? And I remember at the time living through anthrax attacks on the trains that we took to go home. I remember at the time seeing our staff, our Barbadian-based overseas staff in our embassies, in masks and gloves on a day-to-day basis, opening something as mundane as mail, Mr. President, because we were going through counterterrorism measures, and we were living in an era that changed the way in which we saw the world forever. I remember, Mr. President, on some days I would go to work, north, south of Pennsylvania Avenue at the OAS headquarters, while my daughter was at school north of Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm being very clear, Mr. President, that in the event that there was ever a terrorist attack, my daughter and I, at the time 3 years old, would be separated because the measures in place required that everything north went north and everything south went south, Mr. President, and my 3-year-old would be left on her own. Mr. President, we see these things as abstract things because they haven't happened to us here at home, but they happen to us in different spaces, in different environments in which we interact. And they happen to our Barbadian people where they're serving abroad as well. They happen to our mission staff who are serving in overseas jurisdictions, Mr. President. They happen to our Barbadians in the diaspora who went to work on the morning of September 11th, Mr. President. Terrorism affects all of us in very different ways. And so these measures are important for Barbados and Barbadians, whether at home here or abroad. But as it relates to the question of financing, Mr. President, we're not talking only about the emotional or the personal or familial impact. We're also talking about another term. Counterterrorism is very often used, and it's very common. But one of the things that is intrinsically inbuilt into this legislation, Mr. President, is the question of counter-proliferation financing. Counter-proliferation financing, Mr. President, is a direct result of counterterrorism measures. We see offshore, Mr. President, many of the agencies who are treating to intelligence and security measures. But right here at the border, as it relates to our border agencies, including but not limited to our customs and border officials, Mr. President, they are on the front line of what we see as border security. And whereas counterterrorism often focuses on preemptive measures, counter-proliferation financing and border measures include, yes, those counterterrorism measures, but they focus, Mr. President, far more oftentimes on preparedness, resilience, and also the ability to take punitive action where breaches can be discovered. And in this instance, the Customs Amendment Act, Mr. President, is important. And so I want to say, Mr. President, that it is important for us to have a conversation with our people about the multiple forms in which counterterrorism measures present themselves. Sometimes a matter may look benign at the surface. We may think that sometimes it is a cumbersome process to be able to have at the border to go through certain security procedures. We may think it is cumbersome and unnecessary, burdensome in some instances, Mr. President, to have a lot of these preemptive measures in place. But the consequences of failing to so do have long-standing and far-reaching implications for all of us, Mr. President, both here and abroad. And part of the reason, Mr. President, it has those far-reaching implications is because, for the very reason that it has not happened here so far. If you are looking for a smoking gun, Mr. President, no pun intended, you are probably not only going to be looking in the most highly publicized war zone. You're not looking in the places where there are already hotbeds, but you're looking in some instances, Mr. President, for soft targets. And in the case of Barbados, known for good governance, known for not a place where we have had instances of financial secrecy to the extent where you can hide money in a jurisdiction like Barbados, What has been important, Mr. President, is a suite of legislation that comes together to ensure that we maintain Barbados' good name, that we maintain Barbados' reputation, that we ensure the fact that we have had no history to date of any negative incidents taking place on a large scale in this country, that we protect our reputation and avoid having us designated as a soft target and as an ideal place to launder the proceeds of terrorist activities. And so with those few words, Mr. President, I want to support the legislation. I want to put into context for us that the legislation is part of our preemption, but it is part of our preparedness as well, and it is to ensure that Barbados is able to engage with our international partners. We are able to meet our obligations under international convention and treaty. We're able to implement the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force in this instance, Mr. President, and that we are in a position where mutual evaluation of our legislation and legislative arrangements can say to us, when it is done again, that Barbados does not have a gap in its current legislative provisions that identifies counter-proliferation financing as a missing component from our suite of legislative measures. And so, Mr. President, I give my full support to this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, sir. I rise this morning to add my voice in support to this piece of legislation because I recognize the importance of putting in place preventative measures in order to ensure that Barbados is in a position to confront these threats of terrorism when they present themselves. And the reality is that Barbados is no longer, maybe it never was, immune to terrorism or terrorist acts. And therefore we should not believe because of our peaceful nature that such events will never unfold here in this country. I listened with great interest this morning as the acting leader of government business spoke to the importance of compliance to these, especially these two UN resolutions, and explain why it was important that Barbados be compliant with the recommendations of the FATF, which primarily looks at strengthening countries' ability to more or less tackle the whole issue of money laundering as well as financing terrorism. We live in a global community. We do. There's a certain measure of interconnectivity between not only Barbados and the region, but Barbados and the rest of the world. There are a number of benefits that can be accrued from this interconnectivity, but there are also a number of disadvantages. Major disadvantages, and one such is the proliferation of terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, really. And I think it's important that Barbados respond to these threats and these vulnerabilities that we face in a proactive way. And I believe this piece of legislation is doing just that. Mr. President, some time ago, I had the opportunity to travel overseas and attend a conference where we look at the prevention of we look at the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and we look primarily at those items which we have in we use on a daily basis, that can be used, that can somehow be rejigged or repurposed into weapons of mass destruction. Chemicals, other biological agents,